Big Chungus?
Chunky Chungus. Today you're watching Disney Channel.
My friend Jenny and I are going to be peeping me in Pobico from Pop Team Epic, so we're going to be attempting to use this simplicity pattern.
You're doing so good. It's mostly me doing the work. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Once Jenny leaves today, I'm just going to be finishing them on my own, but she's here in the background to help me start this off.
We just spent $100 on fabric.
Yeah, all the fabric costs like $82. You know what? That's gonna play after that. The materials. Roll it.
Is that a good intro?
Yeah, there it goes. I'll edit it out. I'll edit it.
It's just gonna like me, Jenny,
and you go, Big Chungus.
Oh, I need to lay over here.
You're currently in it.
Why am I in it?
Here are all of the supplies we got. 5 yards of royal blue broadcloth, 4 yards of shiny white bridal satin stuff, 1.5 yards of this kind of red stretchy fabric, and 4 yards of interfacing with 2 zippers and clippies. Okay, come.
Alright, so it took Jenny and I hours to cut out all of the pattern pieces and only the white pieces of the fabric. Now, usually I fast forward through all of this, and I'm talking over it, but we were together for a while, so there were a lot of good moments that I wanted to leave in. So instead of speeding through all of it, I thought I would put a little compilation of clips together. That way you wouldn't have to watch us cut out all of the pattern pieces, which took so long. So I hope you enjoy these little clips.
Look at this! There's so much. Okay, I just don't want you to be like, but you're like wasting it.
Look. Jenny, you're wasting.
What are you doing? Double cheeked up on a Tuesday? With all that coming up here with all that ass?
We use recycled paper for our pattern.
Yeah, I can tell. Oh, child. Go. Big boobs. Oh, child. Big boobs. You're on TikTok now?
I don't like TikTok very much.
I live on that site. What are you on? How many have you done?
How many have you done?
I'm on number 5.
There were 3 sheets of whatever. And while I was cutting out the second sheet, you had already started.
Oh, that's why I was so ahead of you. Not because I'm faster or I should feel accomplished for anything.
I know. Me explaining that you ain't special.
Why do you take showers?
I've got to bathe.
Just because society tells you to?
Yeah.
You don't need to take showers. Everyone should stop taking showers. It's a TikTok thing. You wouldn't understand.
I just don't get TikToks. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's the difference in generation. You're just like too old to understand.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just such a boomer. I mean.
Okay, boomer. I'm sorry your life's so difficult for you.
I know, right? Such an inconvenience. Do you know how much my time is worth? Nothing. I currently don't have a job.
Same bit.
Is the camera even on? I just realized I don't think I turned it back on.
No, it doesn't look like it's on. Remember when ladies at Joanne were super nice and used to give you like an extra inch of fabric?
Yeah.
I don't do that anymore.
Well, the lady gave you a discount.
Yeah, but like that.
Yeah, but I expected a free bolt. No!
And you're in a fence. You suck.
Don't even, hold on. It's wrinkling.
It's
wrinkling.
Don't even try me.
Oh my god. You're pulling it. Don't even. Hey now. It needs to be family friendly, but not family friendly enough for it's kids content. What's going on over there?
This is why we have extra fabric.
Why did you only do 2 pins?
I live on the danger side. Danger
Alright.
is my middle name.
Move your body.
I don't want to.
Now you're on top of it.
I did it.
I've never been so proud in my life.
You know what's weird is
is that like I can scream at my dad and you can scream at your mom and she won't hear anything, but you say one thing about being gay and I hear your mom from like 10 houses away go, Jenny! And I'm like, how could she hear? But she can't hear you go, Mom! I'm calling out your mother and all mothers.
These are the things that I don't notice that I'm really glad other people notice. Because you're right.
Savaging your mother.
You're right.
I should not have had you do that because the sleeves are longer, so that dot should be a lot lower.
I don't know what to do. Fix that. I don't know how to fix that.
Do you have any tie?
Like, it definitely made sense at the time when I was watching you do it. And then I'm like, hey.
I'm so sorry.
Hold up. All you think about is Zac Efron turning it. It's like, oh, hold up. All the camera's getting is me side laying on Twitter.
And my butt crack.
I'm gonna explain. Jenny put pen on something and I didn't tell her not to, and then she felt bad. Gotta go.
Are you fine?
Yeah.
I just recorded a touching paper.
Bye-bye.
There, Jenny's leaving. She's
Bye,
done.
YouTube. I've done nothing but buy fabric and spend 3 hours cutting out things and then fucking up things. So it's been lovely.
I'm so
I
proud.
need my purse.
I need my money.
Alright, so Jenny isn't here and it's been like weeks since I have touched any of the fabric. I left it all on the floor. I put all the pattern pieces we don't need back in here. And we are doing size 18 for the top part and then size 22 for the skirt. So with all my pieces, because I have longer arms, I had to extend the whole top part and I'll probably have to extend the skirt. Either way, game plan, I am just going to cut out all the pieces for the skirt, the top, the interfacing, the tie thing, and then I'm going to complete Jenny's first because it has nothing that needs to be altered. Okay, just for a reference, Jenny and I have already cut out 1, 2, 7, and 6. So those are the pieces that are going to be white for the top part. So now that all of the white fabric is cut out, I'm going to be cutting out piece 12, 5, 8, 4, 3, and 13 in the blue fabric. So this is me cutting out all of the blue pieces. I just like to say right now, this video is probably going to be way longer than the second video. I usually like to split up my cosplay videos into 2 parts, all like 20 minutes or under. So I'm sorry if this video is aggressively longer than part 2. It's mostly because there are 27 steps to make the shirt compared to the 11 steps to make the skirt and the 6 steps to make the tie. So overall, the shirt just takes a lot more steps and it's a lot harder to make. Right now, I'm recording the audio for this video clearly, and the whole thing in Premiere Pro is 1 hour and 15 minutes. 1 hour and 15 minutes is usually how long I record the audio for 2 videos. This is just the shirt, so I'm predicting that this video is gonna be like 40 minutes, and then the second part is gonna be like 15 minutes. I'm scared, but a heads up, just in case if you're watching this like, why is this video so long? So this was when I was still at my old place, so a couple of clips might be at my old place still because I like to do things randomly out of order, and then when I edit them through, I kind of put them in the order that they should be. I went ahead and cut out all these like little notches off the pieces before I, unpin them from everything. And next I am going to the interfacing, which, oh, is it on there? Interfacing. There's something I haven't used. So, to show the pieces again, I'm doing those for pieces 5, 13, 4, 8, and 3. This is my very first time using interfacing. I've never used interfacing before, and I didn't think I needed it. So interfacing is used between layers of fabric to basically make it stiffer or to hold its shape better, which would have been a lot useful, past years of making cosplay. I never thought I needed it. I was like, interfacing, that's not important. And even when it came up in the last pattern that I had used, I realized after that I should have used interfacing because it would have made the shape stick. So if you're using a pattern that says use interfacing, you could not use it, but it'll make it look nicer in the end if you use it. Ironing things, look, there's so much stuff on the counter. Windex. Here I decided I'd actually be smart and iron out my pieces before I sew them. I hate ironing, I hate doing it. I'm sewing it and it's fine. So the pieces had a fold line in the middle of it, so I was like, I should iron this out before I start sewing it, and this whole pattern took so much ironing. It's not ironing that it's standing there and it's slowly getting, hotter, and I'm like, oh, now I'm sweating and I don't want to be standing here, and ugh. So here I am ironing out all of the shirt pieces. Also, I decided to iron part of the interfacing. I don't know why. It was because there was a bend in it and I wanted, there was a bend in it and I wanted it to be flat.
So, step 1. Stay stitch neck edges of front 1 and back 2 at 1/2 from cut edge in direction of arrows. This stitching stays in permanently and helps prevent stretching on the curved edges. So, I have to follow the arrows and basically go that way, and then in and in on pieces 1 and 2, which I'm going to be doing at a 1/2 inch in on seam 5 on the sewing machine, which should be 3 lines.
Stay stitching isn't really a step I've ever done, but it is a useful step. You're basically using a large machine stitch and it holds the fabric in place. That way when you're moving it around, it doesn't eventually stretch out too far.
Part 2 with piece number 1. To make darts in front with right sides together, fold the fabric through the center of the dart, bringing broken lines and dots together. On inside, place pins at right angles to the broken line and stitch the dot from wide end to point. So we're going to bring the dots together and stitch down into that point, and there should be a dot right there, and right there to form that kind of line. And that's going to be stitched on the inside, this shiny part. Now, it shows a tip. It says to prevent bubble at the point, make the last few stitches right on the fold and leave the thread ends long enough to tie a knot. Do not backstitch. Now, I've done this before. It just means when you get to this part, try to sew as close to that edge as possible and then just tie them together. Don't backstitch.
I don't like sewing darts, but they're important. So this is for piece number 1. And on the pattern, it shows you where the dots are, which basically goes into the side, into the boobs area. Why do I have to laugh when I say boobs? I should be able to say that with a straight face. Darts are kind of hard to sew at first, but once you get the hang of it, it'll be a lot easier. When I sewed my shirt, I did backstitch, which was kind of a bad idea, but whatever.
Step 3, basically the exact same as step 2, except it's for the back piece number 2. So same thing for number 3, just doing the 2 back darts, which are super long on the back.
Just in case I didn't say this before, right now I'm working on Jenny's entire cosplay. So this one that I filmed the whole thing of is specifically for Jenny. For the one I made myself, I had to extend the length of the shirt and the arms by 3 inches because it went way up and exposed my wrist.
Alright, so finishing up step 2 and 3, I need to press the dart flat along the stitching to blend the stitches, then press dart towards center. So,
oh my gosh, we made it to my new place. This is the step I left off of before I moved. The reason I filmed doing all of Jenny's instead of mine was because I was adjusting mine so much in different small parts just to make it longer, because it was definitely wide enough, it just wasn't long enough for me. But Jenny's was to the exact of the pattern instructions, and I didn't want to differ from the pattern because I was using it and I was making a video explaining how to use the pattern. So I was like, I'll make all of Jenny's first and then I'll make mine on my own.
So we have made it to step 4, still using pieces 1 and 2, and it says with right sides together, stitch front to back at shoulder seams. So there and there.
Now that I started filming at the new place that I live, I'm sorry if the angles are a little weird. It took me a while before at my other place to get the right angles and the right lighting, and just throughout this whole thing, I couldn't sit in the right spot. I was always casting a shadow.
Okay, we've made it to step 5, so we're going to need both number 3 pieces and the interfacing piece. Apply fusible interfacing to wrong sides of collar following manufacturer's directions. Now, all of this information is if you're using
the ribbon, but I am not, so we're gonna just not go over any of this. Now, I've never used interfacing because, so this might turn out badly, but here are the instructions for the interfacing, and I will try to follow them as best as I can. So I have already cut out the interfacing pattern, and it says fusible featherweight, place fusible side of fusible featherweight against the wrong side of the fabric, pin, then steam baste along edges on tip of iron. Okay, let's just do that first, step 1. I don't know why it took me so long to figure out how to use the interfacing. After I did it a couple times, I was able to figure it out. Now, there are multiple types of interfacing for different types of fabric and projects. The kind I got is the kind that you iron on and it basically glues to your fabric, hence fusible. And oh, look at that. I looked up a video and I watched the video on how to use fusible interfacing because I didn't understand the instructions. So you basically take the iron and you put it on the steam setting and you go around all of the edges very lightly. I'm not sure if you're supposed to press it or not, but I pressed it a couple times. That way it starts to stick around the edges before you do the big part. Okay, next step, step 2. Cover with a damp press cloth with an iron set to wool/steam setting. Press firmly in place with a full 10 seconds. Repeat lifting and slightly overlapping iron until all interfacing is fused. Steam press on right side, let fabric cool, then check bond. That little thing right there with the iron that it's not focusing on. Alright, cool. Oh wow, it didn't focus on that very well at all. So the little picture was basically showing you that with every step you do, every time you push down the iron, you should overlap your last iron spot. That's to prevent it from getting bubbles or little puckers on your fabric piece. I didn't do that very well and I had to keep going over it a bunch of times because I still wasn't fully understanding it, and I'm like, it should just stick, right? No, didn't. When I did my shirt, I was able to get it. As long as you overlay your iron in the specific spots, then you should be able to get the whole thing without any bubbles. Oh yeah. Also, when I did my shirt, I forgot to flip it over and re-iron the other side, so a lot of the interfacing started to like slip off on the corners. And then here's me just checking to make sure everything stuck. Alright, so now we are on step 6, and it says with right sides together and raw edges even, stretch facing to collar, leaving notch edge open, trim seam in corners, clip curves. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the right sides together and we're going to sew all along this line except for this line, which has these little notches, and then we're going to cut the corners and then cut little slits along the curved line, that way it doesn't look all weird and bunchy. So I originally cut out 2 blue pieces, so I'm just pinning it to the other side, that way you can flip it inside out. Now, I've never sewn interfacing before, so my sewing machine was just as shaken as I was when I started. At this point, I hadn't changed my tension in the sewing machine at all, so it was kind of rough and loud. But I'll talk more about sewing machine tension in part 2, because that was rough. From the inside on the top, I measured each cut out by 1 inch, and then I just cut the slits and clipped the corners. Now we are on step 7, and we're just going to do the first part of step 7, which is turn collar, press, and machine baste raw edges together. So we're just going to flip this whole thing inside out, iron it, and then baste the raw edges together. It was kind of hard ironing this part because obviously one side of the fabric was super thick with the interfacing and the other part was really thin. So if you're doing this, just take your time. Also, I didn't machine baste the raw edges together on either of the shirts. Yes, I cast a big shadow on this piece of paper aggressively. Let me just move my body out the way. Okay, continuing on with step 7. It says, on outside pin collar, facing side to neck edge, matching centers and placing small dots at shoulder seams. So that little dot right there, so you know where the seam is. And then baste. So we're basically gonna take this piece and sew it all along the neckline, matching up. Ooh. Spin my child. Matching up the notches with each other. So if you get this pattern or you get a pattern like this, please remember those little circle dots, just just mark them off with a pen and try to put them mostly on the inside is what I try to do. A lot of the times I forgot to put the little circles, the marks, and things were a little off, but I was able to figure it out.
Alright, so apparently I pinned it wrong. So I'm gonna take a break. I'm gonna go take a shower, and after I'm gonna watch Attack on Titan. What am I doing? Oh, it's too zoom. No, stop zooming. Semi-closer.
So in the beginning, you see those kind of little points that meet up in the V of the collar. Before I did the next step, I kind of cut them just a smidge, because when I was mapping it out, it looked like they were gonna end up poking through the outside. So I never tried just leaving them. Like, as you can see, they kind of overlap each other. I just cut them, just cut a little bit of those triangles off the edges.
Okay, step 8 now. We're going to take pieces 5 and 4 and we're going to apply the fusible interfacing to the wrong side of each of those pieces. So let's do that first before we do anything else in step 8.
Same thing as before, fusible interfacing. I will say it is a lot easier to put interfacing on smaller pieces than a big piece with a massive hunk in the middle. Also, be careful with your iron. Every time I was pressing it down, my hands got really hot, and a couple of times I burned myself and almost burned myself because I kept putting my hand too close.
Finishing off step 8, I'm gonna stitch shoulder seams of facing sections. So I'm just gonna be sewing this onto this. That way they're attached right there. And then for this part, it says to finished unnotched edge, which is all along this side. It says stitch 1/4 from edge, turn under a long stitching and stitch, or zigzag over edge, or overlock serge over the edge. So this is just comes down to preference. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to do the 1/4 seam along the whole edge, and then instead of folding it, I'm just going to zigzag it. So just along this edge and then use zigzag stitch along it.
This pattern, I tried really hard to read out all the instructions and do everything super clearly. So at some of these parts, if I'm talking about whatever, it's probably because it's very obvious what I'm doing. So I don't have one of those machines that kind of finish your edges, so I just do a zigzag stitch, or I do the fold over part like it said. If it's on the inside, I mostly just do a zigzag stitch. If it's finishing off an open edge, then I'll fold it over, but this piece is on the inside, so if you wanted to, you wouldn't even have to finish your edges. I'm pointing at number 10 stitch, which is the biggest zigzag stitch on my sewing machine. But yeah, if you have crunch time and you just can't finish it, I mean, you could not if you didn't want to. Not that I'm suggesting that you don't finish your cosplay properly. I'm just saying, if you didn't want to, you don't have to.
Step 9. It says, with right sides together, pin facing to neck edge over collar, matching centers and shoulder seams. Stitch along stitching lines on facing and a long seam line. To reinforce seam to center front, stitch over first stitching. Trim seam, clip curves, and to stitching at center front. Oh god. This is confusing me. Oh no.
This part took me a little while to get, and here you can see me clipping the triangles I mentioned earlier. So even though it shows it on the outside, I decided to flip it and pin it through the inside, mostly because during step 1 you added the stay stitching, so I wanted to be able to see it, that way when you flipped up the collar you wouldn't be able to see random stitching lines in there. I mean, not that it matters, I mean that part clearly folds over, it bothered me. So with the blue sides together, I pinned it on the inside. That way I can sew it over the white part to make sure I missed all of the stitches. That way all the stitches were on the inside. Try to be careful where you start your stitch and where you end it. Right on the V part of the collar, it's going to be clipped. So if it isn't a good stitch, I'd recommend going over it.
Okay, step 10. Turn facing to inside. To keep facing from rolling to outside, secure it to the seam allowances by tacking it by hand, stitching it in the ditch, or using small piece of fusible web. So I'm just going to be stitching it to the inside.
Alright, so here I'm me clipping the curve parts. That way when you flip it, it doesn't bunch up. And also clipping right down that triangle. Try to get as close to the stitch as possible, because if not, like I did just now, you will have to flip it in and out again and again to make sure that it flips right. I feel like Jenny's gonna watch this and she's gonna see all of the little things I did while I made her cosplay. She's gonna be like, what is this? This is what you made for me? Right, so now I'm just ironing out the collar. And there were a couple moments where it was a little bit bunchy, but I just kept ironing over it and eventually it looked somewhat normal. So in step 10, it mentions tacking your collar piece by hand on the inside. It basically means piece 5 and 4 that I had just sewn onto the inside. You're basically gonna sew it into the seam allowance on the shoulders, not going through it, that way it's seen on the outside, just on that seam allowance part.
Step 11 is sewing the trim on. We don't need that, so we're just gonna skip right to step 12. With right sides together and raw edges even, pin facing to inset. Stitch upper and side edge with small dots in a 3/8 seam. Trim corner clip curves. So that right there with piece number 6, we're gonna sew along this top part and then along the line with the dots.
So much trim. I'm skipping all of the trim. It's because in the Pop Team Epic cosplay, there is no trim on any of their shirt or their skirt. So I just keep skipping right by it because I don't need it.
13. Turn, inset, press. Baste raw edges together. Zigzag or overlock / serge raw edges together. On outside, stitch socket half of snaps to front inset at small dots on side edge. Oh my goodness. I got these snaps at Walmart and I'm gonna be using these medium ones in the middle.
So I'm just flipping that piece inside out and ironing it. For this piece, I recommend cutting 4 little notches instead of 3 because the one I did right in the middle gave Jenny's a weird point and not like a nice round off. And then just sewing in a zigzag stitch. Here I am hand sewing the snaps. There are 3 snaps on that little triangle, and then you sew the other 3 halves onto the inside of your shirt. Now, it took me a while to figure out what this was, so during this stage, I had stopped and started working on the sleeves, and it was because I didn't buy the snaps at first. Now, we didn't think we needed the snaps because we didn't know what they were for. Jenny and I were talking about how we didn't know how we were going to get into the shirt because there wasn't a zipper. So I remember messaging Jenny and being like, this is how you get your head in. It's the snaps. I need snaps. What hurt was when I went to Walmart and they didn't have these kinds of snaps. And then like a week later, I went to a different Walmart and finally found them. So yeah, snaps. That's how you get your head into the shirt.
Step 14. Open out front facing. Pin inset to right side of front facing. Finger pressing seam allowances toward facing. Matching seam lines, small and large dots as shown. Machine based along seam line from upper edge to large dot, being careful not to catch in collar.
Now, I have no idea what this means. This might not be executed very well, so it might come real bad.
Okay, so this is when I figured out what machine basting was, this late in the game. This is when you sew a large machine stitch onto something and you basically remove it later because you're eventually going to sew over that piece. Or at least that's what I got. Again, reading out the instructions, trying to figure out what I'm doing. I'd say try to sew as close to that line mark as possible. And when I first put it on there, I'm like, how am I supposed to see if the white part is covering it? It'll be okay. You're gonna sew over it again anyway. And then tying up the ends together and cutting the strings. I've never sewn a school uniform or gotten one. I've never bought one before, so it was nice to see how they're actually made. I hope this is how they're made. If not, I mean, come on.
Step 15. Press inset out, pressing inset away from collar. Sew knob half of snaps to right side of facing at small dots as shown.
Anytime it says at small dots, it basically means the small dots you were supposed to add from the original pattern piece. Of course I didn't and had to add them back later. They were on piece 4. I mean, if you forget, you can always kind of size up the pattern piece to the thing that you sewed and re-add the dots. But if you remember to do it in the beginning, it'll be so much better in the long run. I feel so bad for Jenny because this is one of the parts I messed up on. I only went over each of the snaps once, and on mine I did it twice because I realized they started to pull away from the fabric because I didn't sew them nicely enough. So Jenny, if your snaps are a little loose, sorry. But yeah, that's how you get your head in. You just unsnap it, slip it on, snap it back.
Step 16. Turn collar toward neck edge. On outside, top stitch neck edge of top close to neck seam through all thicknesses, breaking and reinforcing stitching at large dot. Be careful not to catch in free snap edge of inset. So we're just gonna flip the collar up and basically sew along the entire side, I think, except for the part with the snaps, not to like sew that on there.
So just flipping that blue collar piece up, not the one that's sewn onto the inside. That's what you're sewing it to. Now in the picture, it only shows it going over the bottom and the back of the neck, but I went around the whole thing.
We've done it. We've made it to step 17, which is the last step in the shirt part. Stitch front to back at side seams.
So here I'm pinning the side pieces together, matching up the triangles I had cut out. So when Jenny and I first filmed us cutting out all of the pattern pieces, that was back in December during her vacation from college. So it was a while ago when we started this, and we were getting ready for Anime Boston 2020, which had gotten canceled. So when I was sending Jenny clips and we were watching together what we were talking about and all of the funny moments, we were joking around about how we were so optimistic and excited for Anime Boston and conventions and how we didn't know what the world was gonna be like at this time. And we're like, oh god, they don't know. They can't hear us. And what made it even worse was like we were talking about how we were so done and, you know, Jenny was ready to go home and I was ready for her to leave. And we're like, wow, they're taking their time together so for granted. Oh, they don't know that they won't be able to see each other. This is so upsetting.
Alright, so step 18, using pattern piece 7. To ease top of sleeve between notches, stitch a long seam line and 1/4 inside seam line using a long machine stitch. So that would be going along this top part and then stopping before you hit the dots on the original pattern piece. To gather lower edge of sleeve between large dots, stitch a long seam line and 1/4 inside seam line using a long machine stitch. So the same thing on the bottom, and then lastly stitch underarm seam right there.
So yeah, I was really bummed out when Anime Boston got canceled. So I had stopped working on our cosplays for over a month because I was like, what's the point? What's the point? And then PortCon got canceled. So I was like, all right. And I decided to post, you know, other videos on my channel. But then I thought it's been way too long. I need to finish this and edit this. So ease stitching are 2 lines right next to each other, and then you're gonna pull the threads and it'll basically bunch everything up. That's basically what the ease stitches look like. And use your biggest or your longest machine stitch. That way it'll be a lot easier to pull the threads through. And then just sewing the underarm seam of both sleeves.
Now, step 19 with piece number 8. It says, apply fusible interfacing to wrong sides of sleeve band 8. Now, I'm not going to be using any trim, so the rest of this you don't have to worry about.
So again, fusible interfacing, same stuff as before for both the cuffs. Can't believe how much interfacing was in this shirt. I mean, now that the shirt is complete, I can kind of see why, and I'm glad that I put the interfacing in. But if I had just made the shirt, I would have definitely not used any interfacing and been like, alright.
Next, step 20. With right sides together, stitch notched edges of sleeve band. Press under 5/8 on long unnotched edge of band, trim to 1/4. Sewing these two together.
See, one thing that kind of sucks about the interfacing is once you get the cuffs on, if you don't iron it and if you leave them flat, they'll kind of like hold a crease shape, which is a bummer. I mean, it's a good thing and a bummer. Like, the interfacing is supposed to do that. It's supposed to hold its shape. So if you're going to crease it, then it's like, oh, there's a crease in it now. And before, I was marking up how much to fold up. That way I can fold them all up evenly and then just ironing it out so it holds that shape. I'm sorry, it's 1 a.m. I'm getting real tired. My voice is getting a little, I'm just...
21. With right sides together, pin lower edge of sleeve to sleeve band, matching seams and large dots. Pull up gathering stitches to fit baste. Stitch. Trim seam, press seam toward band.
It's been so long since I recorded audio for one of my cosplay videos. I'm starting to run out of steam. I'm just watching this like, I guess it's a lot more difficult watching this now because I made Jenny's and then I made mine. So I'm reliving this. So this is the sleeve part, which is pulling the pull. Oh my god, I'm losing it. Yeah, so this is the pulling of the ease stitching. So you're basically pulling 2 of the strings and bunching up the fabric. That way it'll eventually fit the shape, even though part of the fabric is too big. Take your time with this, because you want to make sure your bunches are even and well distributed throughout it. But like I just did, before you start bunching it up, make sure you pin your notches together. That way they're even when you sew them. Let me readjusting my camera. There we go. Here's a better angle of me pulling the strings and bunching it. Finally, I'm doing something, even though I'm casting a shadow through it too. This part was really hard to sew because it was right in the sewing machine and the pins kept snatching the thread. Just go easy, take your time. Or you know what, do whatever you want to do. If you want to go fast and sew right over your pins and break your sewing, no, it's not. Don't do that. That's bad. Your needle will break and it will fly into your face. I mean, you can see my head peering in just because I'm trying to figure out what's going on. I'm clearly trying to look in there like, why is this so difficult? See, look, the back part didn't have any bunches, but see, that looks nice.
22. Turn band to inside. Press. On inside, pin pressed edge of band over seam. Slip stitch band over seam.
So here's me just flipping it over and ironing the seams down. I just like to say slip stitch. Do the people at Simplicity just absolutely hate you? I mean, come on. Slip stitch. I'm done. This took me over an hour. This took me hours actually. Like the video in Premiere Pro is massive, and even then I have it fast forwarded at 1,000. So slip stitch is basically when you fold it up into the inside, and they said slip stitch through the through your seam allowance, which is basically bunched up, right? 2 layers of the blue fabric and then a layer of interfacing. So you're going through like 4 layers of the seam allowance, and then you're going through another layer on the other side to pull the blue in. So my fingers were dying. I couldn't slip stitch right, but it's some type of stitch that will like be invisible on the inside. That way you don't have to have that seam line on the outside. I can't. Why would it matter? Just sew the seam on the outside. Like, it's gonna be that big of a deal. I should have just sewed on the outside. I was so angry. You know what? If you did sew it on the outside, that's preference, and I recommend that better than slip stitching. If you know how to slip stitch and you could do it, go for it. I absolutely hate it. And what was funny was while I was doing this, I messaged Jenny. And I was like, I finished one, and I said to her, I'm gonna slip stitch your other one just to do it right, and then I'm gonna use fabric glue on my cuffs. That way I don't have to do this again. And you know what she said? Jenny was super nice to me and was like, you can fabric glue my other cuff. So thank you, Jenny, so much for letting me fabric glue your cuff in. I mean, it worked. It's not like either of the cuffs look different. You know what? I'd say the fabric glue one turned out better than the slip stitch one. It was so much easier. And all I had to do was basically, this was the issue I had with the cuffs. I laid it down flat and I placed something heavy on it, and then I let it sit for a while, right? And then I had to re-iron out the cuffs, but it worked. So work. I'm just so tired.
Step 23. Turn sleeve right side out. Hold garment wrong side out with armhole towards you. With right sides together, pin sleeve to armhole edge with center small dot at shoulder seam. Matching underarm seams, notches, and remaining small dots. Pull up ease stitches to fit. To distribute fullness evenly, slide fabric along bobbin threads until there are no puckers or tucks in the seam line. Base stitch. Stitch along 1/8 from first stitching. Trim seam below notches close to stitching. Press only the seam allowance, shrinking out fullness.
Alright, so this step was a hot take because I didn't get it until I made mine. I mean, Jenny's sleeves worked out fine, you know, but why do I keep hitting my mic? They worked out fine, but still, I was like, what? So basically you're matching up the armpit seam with the side seam, and then matching up your dot with the top seam, right? And then you're doing the same thing. You're pulling the ease stitches, that way they will bunch up and they'll fit, but they're basically big enough that way they shouldn't bunch up when you finish sewing them. As long as you distribute them evenly enough and spread them out, there shouldn't be bunches, which is the goal of this. Now, the next goal I didn't quite understand, and I'm sorry if I don't explain this properly. What you basically do is, with patterns, you're basically sewing at the 1/2 inch mark on your sewing machine. That's standard unless it says otherwise. So I went in and I sewed the sleeve at the 1/2 inch mark. And obviously, during Jenny's sleeve, it didn't make it past the ease stitches, which made me very upset. So what I did on mine, and I fixed Jenny's, I eventually kind of figured it out. You're basically supposed to machine baste at a large stitch at the 1/2 inch mark, right? And then you're gonna go over even deeper at the 3/8 mark, and then re-sew a second line at, you know, a regular sewing stitch. So after you sew in more, all of the seams should be on the inside. If not, I would just go over it again.
So I'm not doing the short sleeve, so I can skip all of these steps. The last step is step 27 to finish off the shirt. It says press up hem, press under 1/4 on raw edge, stitch close to inner pressed edge.
I like to do all my ironing in one sitting, so if something requires ironing, I'll wait till the next step to iron it. So in the previous step, it had mentioned cutting off your edges right up into the closest seam, you know, as close as you can get to the seam anyway, and then just ironing out the seam allowance, not on the actual front side of the sleeves. And here I am just ironing out the entire bottom before I pin it up. It'll just make it easier. So now just pinning up that bottom hem and then sewing it. Now I sewed it like this. I could have just flipped it over to the other side, but I just like that side of the sewing machine. It makes it easier for me, and then I can see it better for myself. I don't know why I had to make it more difficult for myself than it had to be. And then again, ironing, so much ironing. And lastly, I am just taking a needle and thread and sewing in the outside seams, tying them and then cutting them off. I also went along the whole shirt and tried to look for any seams that had, not any seams, any threads that had, you know, escaped. And I just cut them as close as I could with tiny scissors. So there you have it. That is the shirt. Sorry it took so long. There was a lot of steps. I'm still hurting inside from it. I'm gonna put up some nice, you know, pictures or videos or whatever's gonna be playing while I'm talking here so you can see nice pretty shots of it. So this is part 1. I'm gonna be posting part 2 very soon. It's going to be the skirt and the tie, and then final shots of the whole thing. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a lovely day.